Let's take a break from our usual programming about the upcoming election to talk about the situation in Victoria, and in particular the curfews that Victoria had during the COVID lockdowns, and how those curfews were not based on scientific or medical advice, and they were seemingly just the brainchild of Dan Andrews, who thought them up as a way to encourage ever more control over Victorian citizens. Now, of course, we all knew this at the time, but it's now emerged via leaked emails that when Dan Andrews imposed these curfews, there was not medical advice in favour of them. Rather, he just imposed them of his own volition. In particular, emails are quoted as saying, the idea of a curfew has not arisen from public health advice in the first instance. That being from Dr. Romanis, who was the public health commander during the time period of 2020. Furthermore, in this way, the action of issuing a curfew is a mirror to the state of disaster and is not occurring on public health advice, but is a decision taken by Cabinet and announced today as an important step in the response. And then Professor Sutton, who is the Chief Health Officer at the time, stated, there appears to be merit in it limiting opportunities for transmission, perhaps especially in high-risk cohorts. So in essence, it appears there was some support for a curfew, maybe, but this was based on an assumption, I guess. There's no particular proposal for a curfew. Rather, it was just dreamt up by Dan Andrews. And indeed, that decision appears to have been made before any consultation was taken in relation to scientific advice. Now, of course, this was already obvious at the time. Why is it that COVID especially comes out and affects people at night after 9 p.m., but it doesn't affect people during the day? It was obviously absurd. In particular, cramming people's outside activities into a smaller time period would increase the instance of people mingling during that time period. So put it this way, say for example people are going out and perhaps doing a walk, perhaps doing a jog. Well, say for example they could spread that out during perhaps daylight hours or spread that out during the nighttime as well. Well, surely that would reduce the amount of transmission relative to people going out during a confined period of time. Indeed, if you were to walk around late at night, there's often relatively few people around, suggesting that there wouldn't be very much transmission at all. Now, it appears this curfew was premised on the idea that people would go out and congregate in groups late at night, maybe partying or meeting at houses or whatever the case might be, and therefore there'd be transmission because of this. However, everyone else was affected by this, and people could just party during the day, so there's no particular reason why this curfew was going to be necessary. It was obviously a little bit absurd to lock people at home between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. It made no sense whatsoever, and there appears to be little if any evidence the curfews had any positive impact during this time period. Indeed, for this reason, other states didn't have a curfew because it was patently absurd at the time, and the emails that have come out just confirm this. It shows us that Dictator Dan was basically just on a power grab, trying to exert ever more power over everyday Australians. That appears to have been the modus operandi of his whole administration, something that appears to have been continued on under Jacinta Allen, albeit rather more ineptly. It beggars belief that the Royal Commission that was launched into this didn't investigate the state's handling of things. That, of course, appears to be because Anthony Albanese was trying to protect his mates in the state governments. People like Dan Andrews, who reportedly is now advising Anthony Albanese, which should disturb us all. Nevertheless, it appears we've got a bit of a trash fire in relation to the COVID handling, which I guess is not a particular surprise. It's nice that we've got this information now, but it's too little too late. The damage was already done, the curfew was already imposed, we already had the disaster that was Victoria's handling of the COVID situation. Now, of course, I'm just happy that I did not live in Victoria at the time. I do feel sorry for Victorians who were impacted by this, unless, of course, they voted for Jacinta Allen, in which case they're just voting for the same lot that put them through this whole disaster. Now, there's a couple of other things that are probably worth noting about this whole sorry situation. First, it is so bad that even the ABC is reporting on it. Probably not very much, but they are reporting on it nevertheless. This is rather telling, because the ABC has been all in behind the Labour Party and the Greens. The ABC went all in on supporting draconian control during the pandemic. However, the situation was so egregious that even the ABC felt inclined to report on it. Even the ABC has highlighted that Dan Andrews acted without medical or scientific advice. That, I think, is telling. Now let's not sugarcoat things. This isn't telling us that ABC is going to suddenly turn into an impartial organisation. Rather, it's telling us this was so newsworthy and so bad that the ABC even needed to report on it. Second, it puts paid to the idea of just, quote, trust the experts. The idea that one would just blindly follow scientific or medical advice per se. Now, I generally do follow medical advice from medical doctors, not from politicians. And when politicians are saying they are wanting to trust the experts or follow medical or scientific advice, it appears they're just making things up. It appears they're just making up their own mind and then trying to reverse engineer some science or medical advice to try to back it up. Some of that advice doesn't even really exist. They're just outright lying to us. Now this shouldn't really be a surprise, but it is telling, and it indicates to us that every time the politicians are saying, trust the experts, they're probably just BSing us, and are probably just doing whatever they wanted to do anyway, and are trying to fake having some reason to do so. Third, and I think rather troublingly, it does appear that some of the scientific and medical experts went along with Dan Andrews' idea here, went along with the curfews. They were never actually based on medical advice. It appears some people were complicit through their silence. I think that's also troubling. And it raises the question of why is it that people aren't trusting legitimate medical and scientific experts? And it could be because some of them were silent when they shouldn't have been. And some of them perhaps should have been calling out things like these curfews, and they weren't. Now again, to be very clear, many were, but there's certainly a large number that were not, and certainly a large number that might have been complicit through their silence, and complicit through their decision to just let the politicians do whatever they wanted. I want to be very clear here, the medical experts had a very difficult time doing anything about this, because they risked being deregistered and risked being unable to have a livelihood. And if you've got a mortgage, well, that's a really tough decision to make. But the people I'm really looking at here are academics, who clearly were not at risk of losing their medical practicing license because they were not practicing medicine. You would have thought they should be standing up and saying something, but unfortunately it appears that not enough of them were, which allowed people like Dan Andrews to just run roughshod over everyone. And hence why we ended up in the situation we did in places like Victoria. And the unfortunate thing is we're all paying for this, because Victoria is such a complete basket case that the rest of Australia needs to pay for it. Their fiscal situation is so terrible that they're effectively going to need to be bailed out by everyone else. We can thank Dictator Dan for this. I do rather wish there were a way to make politicians foot the bill for their own stupid decisions. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that that's going to occur anytime soon. Still, let me know your thoughts about Dictator Dan and the situation in Victoria. Do you think he was justified in having these curfews, or do you think they were a silly idea that was never supported by any scientific or medical evidence, let alone common sense? Let me know what you think in the comments below.